What's up everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Mike and I'm a wedding filmmaker based in New York City. And in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the top 5 reasons why you might want to purchase the A7 IV, or maybe hold off and save a little more and buy the A7S III. And before we begin, I'd really appreciate it if you guys can hit that like button and subscribe for more content. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Sorry, I have my notes right here. So reason number 1 why I would get the A7 IV is the form factor. Well, specifically the form factor and the ergonomics. Choosing the right camera is such a huge deal when it comes to event videography, especially when it comes to weddings. You want to have something that's light, but on top of that, something that is very ergonomical. The A7 IV is super light where it won't kill your back, and the ergonomics of the camera is so well designed that it makes the camera super easy to use. Moving on to number 2 is actually the ergonomics of the camera. This ultimately allows you to have a faster workflow, and for any events that you're shooting, you definitely want to have a really fast workflow. With all the custom mode dials and buttons, this allows you to make quick switches, and this also allows you to access functions where you normally would have to find through the menu system itself. The great part about the A7 IV is that they switched the exposure compensation dial with a new custom mode dial. And for me, I programmed that to be my white balance, which is such an awesome feature to have. So with one hand, I'm able to switch my aperture, my ISO, my shutter speed, and my white balance. Being able to do all of that with one hand is super nice. I also customized one of the function buttons, I believe it was C3, to be my Super 35 crop mode, so that I can make quick switches to change my focal length. And as a wedding videographer who solely carries prime lenses, it comes in very handy. Moving on to number 3. This camera has 10-bit codec, which allows you to finally actually shoot on a log profile and also acquire the maximum dynamic range that your camera can provide without compromising the color itself when it comes to grading. And with this codec, it's not just 10-bit 420, it's 10-bit 422, so you're getting a lot more accurate colors as well. On top of that, Sony is doing such a great job with their color science nowadays, so I'm super happy with it. Moving on to number 4. The IBIS in the Sony cameras aren't the greatest in the world, but it is awesome to have regardless. It really helps with those micro jitters, and if you do have an OSS lens, it makes it that much better. I tend to use my gimbal for most of the day, but when you are in a tight pinch, it is great to have that IBIS so that you have that peace of mind. Moving on to number 5. The one thing that I really appreciate about the Sony A7 IV is that it shares the same image quality as the A7S III. And I would have to argue it's a tad bit sharper. Now that does come with a bit of issues, but I'll talk about that more later. Being roughly $1,000 cheaper than the A7S III, there are a little things that you're giving up compared to the A7S III, but when it comes purely to the image quality of both cameras, I think the clear winner is the A7 IV. You're getting very similar dynamic range, color science, and even the low light capabilities. They're very close to each other. So both cameras are incredible in that aspect. Because the image quality was very similar in my eyes, and for me, the A7S III's price point is a little too steep, so that's why I went with the A7 IV. Having said that, the A7S III is my dream camera. If I'm able to get it, I will get it. There you have it. That's my honest opinion. So moving on to the 5 reasons why you should probably steer away from purchasing this camera. So number 1, I think overall, the A7 IV is such a great camera. But number 1 being the rolling shutter. Ever since I purchased this camera, I've been out testing it, and that is the one thing that I've noticed the most. I've noticed that more than the 4K 60 crop, I've noticed that more than the overheating, and boy oh boy, it is getting to my head now. The rolling shutter on this camera is actually pretty bad when you're shooting in 24 frames per second. With that being said, I tend to shoot all of my portrait sessions in 60 frames per second. But when shooting in 4K 60, I noticed that the rolling shutter reduced significantly, which was a huge plus for me. I believe it's because the 4K 60 is oversampling 4.6K, whereas the 24 frames per second is oversampling 7K. I guess there's more processing power, so there is a bit of lag reading that image, and for that reason you get that jello effect. It's great that I know now that when I'm shooting in 4K 60, I'm not going to be running into much of a problem with the rolling shutter, but there are times where I do like shooting in 24 frames per second, so I do have to be very mindful of how I frame a subject, how I move my camera, and what is in the framing, i.e. cars, whatever it might be that's passing by in a quick fashion. So that's something that I always have to be mindful of. I know that the A7S III doesn't have those issues. So moving on to number 2, overheating of the camera. It's winter in New York right now, so I can't really do an actual test on overheating until the summer. But what I did notice is my house is always at a constant 75 degrees. And when I shot in all intra XAVC SI format at 24 frames per second, I would get those overheating signals in about an hour of recording. Let's keep this in mind. If we're in room temperature 75 degree-ish and we're getting that after an hour of shooting, I can't imagine what it would be like during the summer. So I had my screen flipped out as everyone suggests, and the auto temperature setting is set to high as well. So I'm not looking forward to what the summer is going to bring for us. It could be a complete shit show and the camera will just like overheat and just die off on me. So that is something to keep in mind and to really prepare for. There are ways to avoid the overheating. I've seen from Jason Morris's video that he uses an external V-mount battery, and it seems like he didn't have any overheating issues whatsoever. And I believe in Australia, it's the summertime at the moment. So maybe that's something we might have to consider. But for me, everything's about having a light form factor, and just adding a V-mount battery just to avoid the overheating just doesn't make sense to me. Of course, this testing has to be done during the summer season, so I'll let you guys know as soon as I'm able to. So number 3 is actually a continuation of the overheating issue, but this is more so directed towards those people who actually like to hand holding their cameras. And what I've noticed is that when I'm hand holding my camera, it seems to overheat a lot quicker. I haven't done an extensive test on this as of yet, but I did notice that after maybe about 5 minutes of holding the camera, I did notice the camera starting to heat up quite a lot. And I was kind of sketched out by that. I didn't get any overheating signals, but I can only imagine during the summer, if you're doing handhold shots in 90-degree heat, I'm almost certain that this camera could overheat in those types of scenarios. Unless you cage it out and you have a top handle or a side handles, maybe that might mitigate the problem. But again, for me, additional weight is not ideal and I would not go that route. So of course, I'm gonna have to test that out as well. I usually never handhold my camera often. It's just in like those tight pinches where I have to, but my camera's living on a gimbal most of the day, so I'll have to test that out. We'll see what happens. Hopefully, crossing my fingers, it just powers through. Moving on to number 4. So the color accuracy of the LCD screen or the LED screen, whatever it is, does not seem to be accurate with colors. When I import my footage into my computer, the colors seem a bit off. I'm not sure if it's an issue of me not calibrating something on my camera, but what I did notice is that when I look through the EVF, the colors seem to be much more accurate. It's a little bit annoying, but when you are first initially dialing in your color temperature, I would suggest using the EVF over the actual LCD screen. And number 5, what I noticed with this camera when I first did my initial test with it is that when you're shooting in 4K 24p, there seems to be a lot of aliasing going on. When I walked past a lot of areas with much detail, an example of that would be pine trees with pine needles everywhere. I did notice a lot of aliasing going on in those areas. I did notice a lot of aliasing going on in the subject's hair. That was a bit annoying to see. Even when going into my picture profile settings to dial down the details to -7, I did still notice a lot of the aliasing going on in the subjects and the surroundings. So that's something to keep in mind. Again, I think when I was shooting in 4K 60p, most of that problem was significantly reduced. And I didn't see an issue in that format. So with that being said, those are my top 5 reasons why I might consider buying the camera or maybe not buying the camera. I hope this video brought a lot of context to people who might be thinking of purchasing the A7 Mark IV. And as always, if you guys can like and subscribe, that would be wonderful. And comment down below on what you guys think are good reasons or bad reasons to buy the A7 Mark IV. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.